All right, our next speaker is Damion Shelton. So Damion did a PhD at Carnegie Mellon University, and after that founded a company called Free Rivers 3D, which created low-cost, high-volume 3D scanning technology. And currently, he is the CEO of Agility Robotics, which is focused on turning bipedal robots into practical ground transport machines. So,
Thanks. So I noticed there's no PhD after my name. It's because when you say you have a PhD in front of investors, they think you're trying to be smart. And if you say it in a room like this, they worry that you're dumb. And that makes my wife happy, but virtually no one else. Okay, so I'm actually approaching this a little bit differently. I am not the technical brains of the company. That's Jonathan Hurst and Mikhail Jones and all of our engineers. So I'm actually going to be talking about the actual pragmatic side of commercializing robots, which has very little to do, unfortunately, with technology and almost everything to do with lawyers and license agreements. So if you were expecting a lot of tech, I have a couple splash videos at the end, but mostly this will be about the nuts and bolts of stuff. The biggest single piece, and what I'm going to spend most of this talk going over, is the timing aspect. And knowing when to get out of academia and into a startup is actually vastly more complicated than I think is widely understood. The second is, and I'll go into some probably controversial statements here, but intellectual property is not what academia thinks it is, and dealing with that in the context of commercialization is extremely challenging. And then finally, we're a little bit unique because we have former Cassie customers, including Scott in the audience, and we had a built-in business plan, which was just sell robots to smart people who like robots. But that's not really a terminal state for any venture-backed company. So I'll have a couple comments on that too. So this is the background. It actually goes back a little bit further than this, but we go back to the CMU days when Jonathan's work at Carnegie Mellon with a robot called Thumper. There's actually one before this, and then Atrius, which was the Darpa Robotics Challenge in 2015 as a demonstration, and then where Agility got started, which was with Cassie. This is actually a Cassie version 3, which was the first product that we sold in 2017, and then all the way up through Digit V2 and now Digit V3, which is currently sold and is here upstairs. This is demo is happening later this week. For those of you who are not familiar with the technology readiness level scale, it came out of the DoD and NASA and other aerospace work, all the way from very ground truth, basic, science as done on a blackboard, all the way up through actual deployed systems. It looks a little bit different in the NASA variant and spaceflight stuff, but the general concept holds up pretty well. And so this was actually the very first robot that Jonathan ever built, which was the AMAS, which was the actuator with the mechanically adjustable series compliance. Turned out to be a wonderful piece of engineering, terrible design, never went anywhere. So this is an example of an experimental proof of concept. And that is sort of TRL3. So you have all these other steps to go through, and unfortunately, it's the classic adage that it takes 90% of the time to do the first 90% of the work, and then 90% of the time to do the last 10% of the work. And so as you go up, the costs and the time both increase. But this is where, almost 20 years ago, the roots of Digit actually came from. With Thumper, which was the full leg monopod, again using cable drives, which were inherited from the AMAS, but operating on a closed boom. This was around 2006 up through 2008 when Jonathan graduated. This was eventually turned into a biped called Mabel at University of Michigan, but no Agility folks were directly involved with that. And this gets up to the point where the technology is actually validated in the laboratory environment, i.e. you have an idea and you can show that it works, in this case of monopod hopping around the circle. But our former VP of Business Development, Steve D'Antonio, like to call these kinds of things contraptions, which is that occasionally the capacitor bank would blow up, occasionally parts would fly off the robot, and it required a fair amount of hands-on maintenance to keep it alive. So move another 5 years in the future, this was converted into the Atrius monopod in 2011. Some of the very oldest people in Agility in terms of the engineering population did work on this when they were undergrads and are now here as engineers, but this goes back a ways. So this was taking all of the cable drive stuff from Thumper and actually starting to transition over to more classic drive systems and springs as opposed to cable drive. In this case, note that the TRL level was the same. So basically, over this 5-year period from here to here, zero progress was made on a product. It was a technology-only development, but that was important because that unlocked the forward progress here. And one of the things I like to do in my free time is to excavate my Gmail, and the very first conversations that we ever had about starting agility were this was about 9 years ago, which we actually did with this robot. Why you would look at that robot and think that it's a good idea to leave one startup company to join another, I don't know, but apparently I was sufficiently enamored with the idea to do it. Note that we also dodged the bullet of being agility robotics and legged machines for the much cleaner agility robotics. And then this is the point where we actually started fundraising for the company in 2015 with the Atreus PiPet. In this case, the major difference here was it actually got out of the lab. So Atreus was able to go outside, was demonstrated at the DRC, and that was a pretty large step. Very few bipedal robots have ever done that. And we took that as a positive sign for the future of the technology. Now, obviously, what we ultimately ended up commercializing looks, for all intents and purposes, nothing like Atreus. And then Cassie V1, there was only one of these ever built. For you Cassie fans out there, if it has the chin, there was a large laser gyro tucked up under the chin, which is why future Cassies didn't really look the same as this. But this was, arguably TRL-7, although that's kind of a stretch. And that the operational environment here was considered a laboratory environment where it could fall down. There was no constraints applied to the operation of the robot. And there's a saying that's attributed to Steve Jobs most famously, which is real hard to ship. And in this case, we decided to effectively adjust the TRL level of the robot simply by declaring that laboratory environments were our ultimate sales target, which was remarkably effective. So basically, in 6 months, we went from the first article prototype up to delivering the first 3 Cassies in 2017. And I think there was actually a really interesting lesson that we all learned from this, which is that shipping stuff teaches you a lot. You can noodle in the lab until the cows come home, but that doesn't actually yield products. And at some point, you have to just decide that what you've done is good enough and unapologetically sell it. Okay, so moving on to intellectual property. The piece that no one ever tells you with this is that universities, as great as they are, can be very hard to work with. And Oregon State is fortunately actually extremely easy to work with. So we have been actually having conversations with them prior to this point, back to 2014. But it took us about a full year after the company was incorporated to work our way through the licensing process. If you have a harder to work with university, this can go on longer and also be more expensive. But the important thing, if you're considering commercializing any of your work, or if you have students then commercializing their work, is that this process is very hard to change up. So we had to have Agility Robotics, the legal entity, before we could sign the option agreement on the intellectual property. That's basically a slip of paper that we paid a little token amount of money for to say, hey, we're going to negotiate with you for the next year. That led to the final license agreement with the university, again, almost a year later. And we had to show that to our investors in order for them to write us a check. Unsurprisingly, no one wants to write you a check unless they know that you have the legal rights to actually use the intellectual property. So if you're trying to commercialize, be aware that it's almost impossible to avoid doing all these steps. If you don't do them in this order, you'll get yourself in big trouble. And I guarantee, having just completed the funding round that we announced about a month ago, that investors will check continuously and over time and at great lengths to make sure that you've done all this correctly. And if you haven't, it can be a real problem. Fortunately, we had good legal counsel early on in the life of the company, and all this went pretty smoothly. But it's very unlikely, if you're graduating, as an example, that you're going to be able to directly commercialize the technology that you're working on without having started that process in advance. So if you think it's something you want to do, have a conversation with the University Tech Transfer Office well in advance of trying to commercialize. So some other general IP issues to be aware of. Works of authorship like code are in some cases, and I know this is true at Carnegie Mellon, it's not true at the universities, are considered differently from inventions. I.e., if you write a block of code, the code could be worth millions or billions of dollars that belongs to you. The underlying invention in the sense of a patent law or patent filing is usually owned by the host institution. So look into this, make sure you understand the situation that you're in. Invention assignments, in our case, because we were hiring a lot of students out of the university, it was very important for us to make sure that they had actually assigned their IP to the university and not just skated through their undergrad education or grad education without having done that. Again, this is something that investors will check on. Make sure you have an inventory of the files, CAD drawings, and other things that go into actually comprising the tech. In general, it's a serious no-no to directly copy stuff over. So if you have a university laptop, don't assume you can use that in a company setting or vice versa. And then finally, dealing with the continuation of university research is actually in some cases, a really good opportunity, like it was for us, and in other cases, quite a complicating factor. Rarely will a university waive its right to continue working on the student research, as you would hope, as an academic, but that does, in some cases, cause a forking of the tech between the commercialized version and the academic version, which can cause you trouble later. And then I wanted to throw this out just for controversy. Be careful with the GPL. I taught open source code for a bunch of years. I did open source development at the National Library of Medicine back in the late 90s. And so I love open source. Very few VCs are excited about it unless you have a business model that specifically leverages the GPL, in which case, more power to you. In the case of hardware, it gets really tricky really quickly. People don't want to necessarily take academic code that has dangling threads of GPL compliance and stick it into large commercial products. This is not a claim that Stallman's view or the commercial view is correct, just something to be aware of. So as one example, and I'm sure Melanie's been through this with funding rounds, we have had to, every time we've done funding, produce a due diligence table, which is the libraries that we're using the license, where it's used by, whether we've disclosed it in the documentation materials of the robot, and this goes on for pages. And if you don't have this, this becomes a reps and warranties term in the investment document. That can at best cost you a lot of money later, and at worst when you do it in court. So just be very careful with this. Finally, as you start to actually try to build these things, if you're familiar with MRP, manufacturing resource planning, that's where all the CAD files and circuit schematics and all that go for realizing the actual robot construction process. When we picked up this, there was an MRP, which was a subversion repository, which was actually remarkably complete. And so kudos to the university team, but this is nothing you'd ever use in production. So you have to graft a whole lot more process onto it. And then this was actually the very first CAD sequence of materials, which I extracted from some grad students on a notepad. You can see it has a lot of detail. There's 5 lines. In Digit, there's now something like 500 unique components, and not counting electronics, north of 5,000 individual components, more if we were to count all the individual pieces that are on PCBs. So just be aware there's a lot of this cleanup work as you start to do advanced hardware builds that will have to be done to actually export something from the lab. And then final comment on business plan. As I said, we were fortunate here to actually have a built-in early market. And I encourage anybody who's commercializing robots to not listen to your investors. The academic market is viewed derogatorily because it's not viewed as an end state for a company, but in our case, it was extremely helpful because it provided a built-in way for us to take some of our lumps early on. It forced us to figure out things like how do you ship a high-capacity lithium battery without getting sued by the federal government, and other sorts of nuts and bolts things that you don't necessarily get exposed to a lot in straight academics. But don't get stuck there. You do have to tell a story that's bigger and larger than the academic market, and articulate that clearly to investors, again, without apologizing. I encourage anyone who wants to sell product to sell it early and often in academia, because it's a really receptive group of people to work with. In our case, this is what our business plan looked like in 2015, and actually copied this directly out of an early presentation. What amuses me going back and looking at timelines like this from 7 years ago was how correct we were in the general timeline, and that we guessed about right for when we would have Digit, but how horrifically wrong we were with some of the intermediate stages. For instance, there was never sustainable production in 2019. We're only there now, but we've also gotten there with the full robot. So be prepared for this story to evolve, and don't apologize. So I'll leave the sound off on this. This is the video that we just did for our Series B. Something that you'll have to deal with as the company continues to evolve is the fact that you're going to be running things at a lot of different technology readiness levels simultaneously. I won't tell you which is which in this video because I like the ambiguity on it, but there's things all the way from TRL 5 up through TRL 9 here. And in the case of us, because we are effectively a one-product company, we're having to work to develop applications, in this case trailer unload, which is what we're hardening off first in terms of full production, while simultaneously doing things like bin picking, which are at a lower TRL number, but exercise components of the trailer unload task separately. And so what we're finding is that this actually starts to look a little bit like running our own in-house academic projects, in the sense that we've built a platform, we're hardening the platform against a specific task, and then we're also evolving other things the platform can do in parallel as we continue to move forward with it. So, I think, one of the pieces of advice you always give as a startup is never be a hammer looking for a nail, but we just have a really, really, really cool hammer. So to summarize, don't commercialize too early. We spent at this point more than twice as many years in a laboratory environment as we have done commercially. That's helped with our investment and our spend rate. Be careful with intellectual property. If you have questions about that with your university, start that early, and then leverage your academic roots for early business plans, but expand ASAP. And then we're very fortunate to have a population of people now that have grown up with Cassie's in their grad career. This is one of our new hires, and her very excellently designed graduation cap. And then I have another video that I'll play while answering questions here, which is we are getting back actually to our education roots. One of the things people ask a lot of questions about is how do you program bipeds? Are they hard to program? This is some work that Andy Brewer has done with snap blocks, adding a little GUI, and has been having second graders program digit. So with that, I'll take questions.
Questions for Damion?
Yeah, I have a question. So I know that you mentioned like these problems with like IP, and between the university and the company. I know Jonathan Hurst has a lot of research being done in things like state law. So how is that possible? Given,
That's great. So the question was, how do we handle the situation where there is ongoing research being done? This gets into why Oregon State is a friend of the company, and we continue to have good relations. So we actually knew that was going to happen, and actually have a somewhat unusual license agreement that considered IP on a forward-looking basis, basically saying here are the bounds of what we're going to be doing over the next 5 years at the company, the next 5 years at OSU, and actually had that written into the license agreement. That's not always the case. It's often licensed retrospectively, and you get basically a snapshot at a point in time. So if you anticipate stuff being done collaboratively, make sure to address that moving forward.
All right, they can ask a quick question. So Cassie and now Digit, I guess, is coming out of a long legacy of building robots for efficient dynamic locomotion. I wonder what, if any, sort of hardware changes have been made more recently as they start to think about this robot doing manipulation tasks in like warehouse environments.
The main thing, and we have another version of Digit, imaginatively named V4, coming out later this year, adds some low degree of freedom hands to it. Right now, one of the things that we've noticed with the current design is that separating boxes in a trailer unload or a depalletizing operation requires narrower fingers than Digit currently has. Most of the other hardware changes that have happened, honestly, since Cassie, the lower body is effectively still a Cassie body. Most of that has actually been around the robustness and the actual, lowercase e engineering as opposed to capital E engineering work that's been done. So a lot of hardening, a lot of design studies, making sure we've actually gone through and done materials failure analysis and all that kind of stuff that you would never even bother doing in an academic context. In terms of the, how we see this evolving moving forwards, the hardware platform is likely to be stable within the next 18 to 24 months. Which means that there will be AI and learning processes and all that kind of fun stuff from a software stack layer done indefinitely. But I think our fondest wish is that, in the next 10 years, this turns into a smartphone, where it's not like there's a lot of innovation that's necessarily occurring on a daily basis to the hardware platform, and most of the new changes are coming out in software.
So is it generally going to stick with you guys, or any plans to?
That's a controversial question. Depends on who you ask. If you ask me, I would love to see it have a little cart friend that follows it around. But there are also a lot of other companies that make very competent carts. So for the time being, we're a one product company with the input. There's also a lot of competent quadrupeds out there. And so we don't see a need to compete in that space.
All right. Let's thank Damion one more
Thanks.
time.